You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Denkman. Signs of the frosty relationship between the United States and Canada are everywhere, from additional checkpoints at border crossings to fewer Blue Jays fans showing up to T-Mobile Park to see their team play recently. Rhetoric from the president about making Canada the 51st state and tariffs. They have put a wedge between the two countries, and the effects of this split are spiraling out to how we manage natural resources that cross the border. The Columbia River system, which touches British Columbia, Washington, Idaho, Oregon, and Montana, is a major water and power source for the U.S. For 61 years, the two countries have worked closely to control floods and manage hydropower on the river. When President Trump came back into office in January, Canadian and American officials were weeks away from updating the Columbia River Treaty. But now discussions have ground to a halt. Karen Weise has been following this story. She's a technology correspondent with the New York Times, and she's based here in Seattle. Karen, it's always great to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Sure. Happy to join you again. Thanks for having me.
So you've done a lot of reporting on electricity and what's being produced by Columbia River dams and how it's powering the tech innovations that we are seeing it now in that industry. Before we get into the details of this treaty, maybe could you just talk a little more broadly about the importance of the Columbia River for the Pacific Northwest?
Sure. Yeah. So the Columbia River has many different ways it influences the Pacific Northwest. One key one is as a source of hydropower. It's the largest source of hydropower actually in the whole country. And it's the largest source, but by far in the region, and really is part of why the region has relatively inexpensive power, and also what's considered generally green carbon-free power. And that's part of the attraction for technology companies that have set up large data center operations, particularly in Oregon and in central Washington. And those companies like hydropower because it's carbon-free and it's very reliable around the clock. It's not like solar or wind where there's intermittent power sources. And so that's one of the huge benefits it provides. I mean, the river also is this very important cultural, economic resource. There's shipping on it. There's, recreation along it. There's all this kind of environmental ecosystem work that's being done to try to rejuvenate the salmon runs that have been harmed by the dams historically. So it's just this very complex kind of cultural, economic, social force. It's also just gorgeous. I mean, I'm anyone who's spent time along it knows it's just a really special environment and has this really beautiful geography. And it's just a really unique thing that has kind of run through all these states. And with Canada, we all are kind of intertwined through this water flow.
Yeah, and your story for the New York Times has this beautiful build out with photos from different parts of the river. And I recommend people check that out. So this current Columbia River Treaty, it's 61 years old. Parts started to expire last year. Tell us, what's the history here? How did we get here to have this agreement with Canada?
Sure. So there have been dams along the river that predates this treaty, but they were kind of built in kind of individual ways, essentially. And then after World War II, there was a horrific flood in Vanport, Oregon, just outside of Portland. This was a town that had popped up to house shipbuilders in the war effort. And there was this major late spring flood. 18,000 people lost their homes. And that really prompted this long process of working with Canada to better manage the flood protections along the river. And then along with that, the hydropower resources. And there was this idea that we could do this better if we work collaboratively. And actually, the parts of the river system that are up in Canada are better for reservoirs and for flood protection. And the parts of it that are in the US are better for hydropower because they're narrower and steeper. And so this treaty was took a long time to negotiate, and then ultimately was agreed upon where it sort of traded on two elements. Canada would build these dams and house reservoirs for the flood control. And then the U.S. would give Canada a cut of the incremental power that it got from managing the whole river system collectively, essentially. It's called the Canadian entitlement is the phrase. But then this was a 60-year treaty. Either side could give 10 years notice to pull out of it. And it was just sort of there. There were, complaints about it over time. Maybe the kind of role, the indigenous tribes on both sides of the border had no say in the original treaty. And we're in a very different place now in terms of trying to involve more people in decision making. Nothing about the ecosystems and the environmental results of the treaty and just broadly the damming of the river. So a lot has changed now. And there was this kind of very long processes, both in Canada and here, to decide kind of 10 years in advance of these expirations last fall, do we want to stay in the treaty? And both sides said, yes, we want to work to renegotiate. And then there was this very long process to try to renegotiate an updated version of the treaty. And it kind of lingered for a long time and then really gained steam towards the end of the Biden administration, trying to get it done ahead of this 60-year deadline in the fall. And then also, especially when it was clear that there would be a change of administration. And an interesting thing about this is it has a lot of bipartisan support in the Northwest. I mean, literally every congressional delegate in the whole Northwest wrote a letter in 2023 saying, please prioritize this, please get it done. Don't tie it up into other things. Just focus on this one thing as its own discrete conversation and get it done.
So if we just boil it down to the simplest terms, basically Canada manages water flow and protects parts of the Pacific Northwest from flooding. And in exchange, we send them electricity from the dams that are further down the river system. So this has been, mutually beneficial for a long time, but there are pain points, right? Where, for example, the electricity on the American side has gotten a lot more valuable. And there are issues in Canada with the water flow not being totally within their autonomous control, and they want to address that. The last time we checked on the treaty, as you say, things were kind of close to the finish line. What has changed now that the Trump administration has taken over?
Basically, the Trump administration has paused kind of international agreements that were in the works as part of reevaluating what they're kind of working on. And that's typical. That happened when the Biden administration took over from the Trump administration. There was a pause then as well. But what is not typical is this kind of sudden hostility towards Canada. And that has prompted a very nationalistic response in Canada. Canadians have long felt like Americans saw them as something to be plundered, their resources to be plundered. And so the president talking about the 51st state or talking about there being a very big faucet in Canada to tap, those are all kind of very sensitive points. So in Canada, you literally saw in the election of the prime minister, it totally changed national politics. And in British Columbia, there was a town hall that the British Columbia government did. It was 600 people came onto this Zoom. And the minister presenting said he's had people pull him aside in the market, say, we should get out of this thing or use it as leverage for other negotiations. Things that kind of weren't really on the table before. So it's really complicated, this delicate negotiation that's sort of on ice right now. And no one's quite sure when it will be revived and what the priorities will be. I mean, honestly, I had people say they wish I didn't write this story because they were kind of hoping it could just go under the radar and not get dragged into the kind of big debates, but that was already happening in some sense. When the president spoke to Justin Trudeau in February in a very contentious early call, he listed this treaty on this long list of grievances he had of how he felt that Canada was kind of abusing the generosity of the U.S.
What happens if the U.S. and Canada can't come to an agreement here? What if this whole thing blows up or fizzles?
Yeah, it wouldn't be overnight everything would become a disaster because it's structured in ways that has these kind of exit provisions that are take 10 years fully. But right now we're just operating under a 3-year interim agreement, particularly on the flood control components that has some uncertainty in it. So for example, the kind of flood control that Canada provides through the reservoirs, the payment for that was baked in the 60-year treaty and is now kind of sort of like a pay-per-use type of model, but that requires congressional appropriations every year. And so there's always uncertainty with anything that requires congressional appropriations. So kind of at a high level risk, there's a worry of just basically that you can't collectively manage it, that you can't get the amount of flood protection that you need or the right way to pay for it, and that the whole thing could essentially kind of slowly blow up, I guess you could say. There's other kind of collaborative things that we're doing, like trying to improve the salmon flow upstream because it's kind of completely cut off at points. So all those things, all that kind of cooperation would go away as well. And one thing, I talked to people who had worked along the river, essentially worked with elements of the treaty. And they say, you're kind of in like daily contact. The water managers, the dam managers in Canada and the US talk constantly, particularly if there's a storm or rain or a major event like that. And that just requires just a base level of trust and cooperation. And you don't, one expert on water treaties said to me, you don't want to have to line by line put every single eventuality in a treaty. You want to build a framework for trust and then being able to adapt, because we're dealing with nature. We're dealing with nature in an era of climate change and less predictability. And so you really want to have a collaborative relationship to prevent floods, and then also to maximize the hydropower potential, to maximize the potential to bring, salmon back upstream and really into their more natural habitats. So there's a lot going on. And on the Canadian side, they also want to restore the ecosystems around the reservoirs that they've created. They draw down a lot to prepare for taking on snowmelt. And so imagine if you live in that community where part of the year you're sort of waterfront and part of the year it's like miles of dry lake bed essentially to get to the water. So they want to restore kind of a riparian ecosystem, have lower fluctuations, and be able to have control over their own ecology and cultural life there.
President Trump, when he's dealt with these sort of international agreements, he sees himself as a deal maker. He sees himself as trying to get the better deal for the United States that we've been taken advantage of in the past. This is a pattern that repeats itself over and over again. And the way he approaches these things, he likes to rip up the old treaties. And then sometimes the new treaties are really similar to the old ones, but, he's claiming victory. Do you see this dynamic potentially affecting the way the Columbia River Treaty is now negotiated? Is he going to want to start from ground zero, maybe make some saber-rattling type demands here, shake things up, but ultimately move forward? I mean, what did the people you talked to feel like could happen here as the Trump administration's moves become more clear?
I mean, the thing that everyone said to me is in water treaties, you always have the advantage when you're upstream, and we are downstream. And so that is just a reality of how water flows. And so there are ways in which he could claim kind of success with even the current kind of outlines of an agreement. For example, it cuts over time by half how much of the value of the electricity that Canada gets. That could be a victory on its own if you claim that,
But that was somebody else's negotiation.
Yeah, but
Karen.
I mean, does it matter? You know what I mean? I understand what you're saying, and maybe you tweak it a bit. One of the things someone spoke to me that said, Trump may not care about involving Indigenous tribes or about salmon restoration, but the Canadians really do. And so that could give us leverage in a negotiation. Now, the person I spoke to does care about those things, but she's saying they shouldn't be thrown out entirely. And I think that's a concern, because there is kind of this more ecosystem approach, environmental approach, acknowledging climate change, that it's not been a priority of this administration. But I think clearly in terms of the raw power, which I think would be the thing that would be most kind of enticing to him. I mean, we are reclaiming a lot more of that for the U.S. And, I could imagine a world where that could be enough for him to claim victory. But there's just a lot of uncertainty because it's so delicate. There's not a ton of transparency about what was even in the interim agreement. So I've talked to folks who were like, the Canadian government actually put out way more info than the Biden administration did. So a lot of people in the U.S. look to disclosures from Canada. But still, the outlines of the agreement was just, I think, like 2 or 3 pages or something. So the details matter on issues like that. And so it was hard for people to know, like, where might there be more room to push? Were we really getting quite as much control over hydropower as we need, or whatever it may be? So I think there's still room for it to survive. And no one I spoke with thought it should blow up. And I think the fact, for example, Idaho Senator Jim Rich, who's the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, has been a major proponent of this, along with Senator Maria Cantwell. And they've been, in lockstep consistently. So I think
a Republican and a Democrat.
A Republican and a Democrat, and powerful Republican, particularly on foreign matters. And she's a powerful Democrat in terms of economic and commerce matters. So I think, there's a potential for that to help kind of keep it alive, essentially. That's what people are pointing to, in particular, that relationship.
Is this in danger of getting tied up with the tariff showdown? And, is that part of the reason that this is maybe going to be sticky going forward? Like, will this become a bargaining chip between Canada and the U.S. over fentanyl or auto or steel tariffs?
Yeah, I think the reality is those are more like burning issues that are kind of, if you're chasing the fires, that's where you go now. So I'm not sure like this would be directly play into it, but those negotiations do impact the general tenor of the relationship that you need to negotiate a complicated treaty like this. So I think mostly it would be more downstream of those negotiations than saying, oh, we're going to pull out of the Columbia Water Treaty if you don't do this with tariffs or whatnot. Everyone who's been involved with the treaty seems to not want it to be a bargaining chip, but that said, it was on his list of grievances. So it's clearly on someone's mind somewhere in the administration as something that could be played. But this is, part of why I wanted to write about this isn't the immediate fire that's exploding in front of us, where there's so much news right now that is just immediate. This is the kind of long-term consequence that can happen from this frayed relationship. So I think that is more where it would play in than versus like a direct thing where it would be in the news in a week from now or something as they negotiate whatever with the tariffs. But the tariff environment absolutely triggered these kind of more nationalistic responses in Canada.
And the election of Mark Carney, the more liberal prime minister, which was, a flip-flop, as you say, from where the politics of that country were going before Trump started to talk about the 51st state and all of that. Karen Weise, technology correspondent for the New York Times, her most recent story is called "A Crucial River Treaty is Tangled in Trump's Feud with Canada." Karen, it's always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for talking about the treaty.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. This show is only possible because listeners support us. If you're able to give right now, please check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.